In the small Canadian town of Pontypool, Ontario, radio host Grant Massey is driving to work, pushing through snow and a blizzard. At the same time, he's talking on the phone with a colleague. Grant is very irritated and even threatens to fire the guy, then simply tosses the phone aside. But the colleague keeps calling, forcing Grant to pull over to find his gadget. Suddenly, an unfamiliar woman taps on his window, shouting some incoherent words. Grant turns away for a second, and when he decides to open the window, the woman on the roadside is already gone. The man is surprised by the incident, but soon brushes it off, especially since he's already arriving at his radio station. There, Grant is greeted by his colleague, Laurel Ann, who is already sitting at the console preparing to take calls while also searching for news to cover on air. The girl asks him to skip the silly jokes, and Grant heads to his workstation. He greets Pontypool and talks about the terrible weather when producer Sydney Breyer, who diligently ensures the host doesn't chatter too much, enters. Grant plays a song for the listeners, then answers a call from reporter Ken Loney, who's reporting on the snowstorm he's watching from his helicopter. Next on the air is a constable involved in an operation to destroy illegal cannabis crops. Grant spins the story, but Sydney asks him not to exaggerate and cuts him off. A scuffle ensues between them as she doesn't support his imaginative flair. Grant is outraged by the limitation on his freedom of speech. Eventually, the two reach an agreement, and Grant switches to innocuous news about a missing cat. He suddenly remembers the woman he saw on the bridge. He describes the situation and asks if he should have called 911. Strangely, no listeners are calling in, though they usually respond immediately to questions. Laurel Ann intercepts code 48, which signals a hostage situation. She tunes into the police frequency, but there's no confirmation. Sydney asks her not to inform Grant yet, as he is distracted by a man discussing urgent calls. Suddenly, the host begins talking about a couple of criminals who have taken hostages and are holed up in a truck. Sydney tries to steer the conversation, but it only gets worse. Grant starts talking about the end of the fishing season when both the police and fishermen drink too much alcohol. Sydney, exasperated, listens to Grant while he merely laughs at the overly serious woman. The producer suddenly reveals a secret. Their journalist Ken, who claims to be watching the weather from a helicopter, is actually sitting on a hill, but people like to think he's risking himself for them. Later, Sydney admits she spoke with the constable, and he seemed frightened. Then a call comes in from Ken, reporting possible unrest at Dr. Mendez's office. A large crowd has gathered, demanding the doctor be held accountable for negligence. Grant puts Ken on air, and he describes a scene of chaos and carnage, which has led to many deaths. He hears explosions, but doesn't see any police. Instead, military helicopters appear. The journalist doesn't know what's happening, but it seems very serious. Meanwhile, Sydney and Laurel Ann try to verify the report, but there's no connection with the authorities. To make matters worse, a tour group of Arab settlers arrives at the station for an interview. Grant is outraged by this, but Sydney asks him to focus on the job as they still have no confirmation of the incident. Grant is forced to listen to the guests singing. Suddenly, one of the girls begins saying that God is gone and everything will end soon. She seems to forget her words and starts speaking in unintelligible interjections, which alarms Grant. He is convinced something terrible is happening, but there's no news yet. At this point, a witness named Steve connects with them, but suddenly starts screaming and urging everyone to run. He is cut off. Grant starts elaborating on the topic, though Sydney tries to stop him, thinking they're being pranked, as Ken still hasn't contacted them. Those who call in speak very quickly and incoherently. There are no official comments. Finally, they manage to reach the constable, who says the crowd broke into the doctor's office, where an old woman was present. She later died from her injuries. Sydney is skeptical, but the constable recalls that the deceased kept talking about Hitler. Grant summarizes, the crowd is moving in a specific area, talking about something incomprehensible. Then a call comes in about a family isolated in their car, but Sydney still believes the events are a simulation of something dreadful. Suddenly, a BBC journalist calls the station, asking Grant to confirm that Canadian troops are blocking roads into the country. But Grant knows nothing about this. He tries to refute these rumors, but the BBC journalist is sure they're true. At last, Ken gets back in touch, insisting that something terrible is happening. He's hiding because he saw killings, and it seems people are turning into cannibals. Everyone is behaving like madmen. At that moment, he sees people being dragged out of cars and bitten. Suddenly, Ken sees a guy who entered his basement and collapsed nearby. He says something, and the journalist wants to approach him to hear the words. Grant begs the guy not to do it. Ken's call is interrupted by a broadcast in French. Laurel Ann translates it, but doesn't understand the meaning because they're talking about baby babble. Grant addresses the listeners, asking them not to leave their homes and not to speak English. He even tells them not to translate his message. Pontypool is declared under quarantine. At that moment, Ken reconnects and plays the sounds his injured neighbor is making. They sound like a child's voice, an infant. Then Ken falls silent. Sydney is startled to hear the BBC journalist mention the missing cat. Confused, Grant wants to leave, but Sydney tries to calm him down. Still, he walks out of the studio, repeating the words about the missing cat. He'd seen the notice posted all over town. The man heads for the door, despite the women asking him to stay, and opens it, where Laurel Ann sees a crowd approaching the studio. Grant, Sydney, and Laurel Ann lock themselves inside. The journalist goes on air, starting to tell horrific stories of murders that have spread across the country. The women try not to listen to these terrifying tales, not understanding what's happening to Grant. But soon, even Laurel Ann starts behaving strangely, claiming that Grant is not in the studio. The girl leaves, and a bewildered Sydney makes herself tea when Dr. Mendez climbs in through the window. He sees the strangely frozen Laurel Ann and leads Sydney into Grant's soundproof booth. The doctor explains that their colleague is already infected, though she doesn't realize it. Dr. Mendez goes on air while Laurel Ann begins banging her head against the glass of the booth and bites her lower lip. The doctor says that the world has faced a series of tragic outcomes. However, before taking their lives, people look for someone to share their fate with. At the same time, Ken calls again, saying his neighbor has died. People are constantly passing by him, talking about boats. As he tells this, Ken suddenly stumbles over his words. The people in the studio realize he is infected too. They say goodbye to the reporter and cut him off. Sydney mourns her friend, reminiscing about their work together. Laurel Ann bangs on the glass again. Grant suddenly wonders, can the infected read lips? Dr. Mendez tries to figure out how the virus spreads, then, with horror, admits that it's already here, because it's in the words. Mendez suggests that the virus has infected certain words in the English language. It's these words that spread the infection to others, who then find the next person to kill themselves with. This is a new path of transmission, and this is the end of humanity because it simply cannot be stopped. A person hears an infected word, understands it, and the virus immediately implants its strains into their comprehension. The doctor asks everyone to be silent, but Grant objects, saying they must tell people about it to protect them. At this point, Sydney receives a call from her children and hears that they've been infected. Laurel Ann spews a stream of blood and collapses, dead. Mendez suspects that it happened because she couldn't find a victim. It seems that this is how the virus exits the body. The group then hears noise outside and realizes a large crowd has gathered at the building. Soon the infected break in and try to get into the sound booth. Grant theorizes that the infected may follow their voices, and Sydney records Grant's voice, playing it through an external speaker to distract the crowd. The infected hear the message that Sydney Breyer is alive and follow the sound. In his excitement, Mendez switches to the Armenian language, and everyone realizes that only English is infected. Grant and Sydney start speaking French, leaving the doctor in the booth and heading to the kitchen. But on their way, they are attacked by the infected Arab girl, whom they barely fend off, eventually killing her, much to Sydney's shock. They look at the doctor in the booth, deciding who should kill him if he gets infected when the doctor runs outside, trying to say something to them. But then music plays, causing the infected to return to the building. Sydney, Grant, and the doctor lock themselves in the control room. The doctor then climbs out their window and distracts the infected, saving Grant and Sydney. The pair find themselves isolated from the outside world. While Grant tries to figure out how to reverse the symptoms, Sydney obsessively writes confessions of killing the girl on the walls and doors, and she becomes infected with the word kill. Grant recalls the doctor's words about the danger of comprehension. A person repeats an infected word, trying to understand it, and becomes infected themselves. He realizes that Sydney is infected by the word kill and convinces her that the word now means kiss. He starts repeating it over and over, and gradually, Sydney's symptoms disappear. The pair kiss in delight. Then, hoping to stop the virus, the journalists go on air, uttering a series of contradictory and confusing words to help their infected listeners. Grant explains the essence of his discovery, urging people to stop understanding what they're saying. The authorities immediately try to cut them off from the air, but the pair ignore their warnings and continue changing the meanings of words. Outside, the sounds of helicopters and gunfire can be heard. The military is killing the infected population. Grant yells, demanding they stop the killings, and suddenly everything goes quiet. The journalist says that tomorrow will bring a new day when they will do the same thing they always do. And the meaning of life is precisely that. This is not the end of the world, just the end of a day. As an amplified voice outside counts down from 10, Sydney joins Grant in the booth, and they kiss. An explosion is heard and the screen goes black. During the credits, news reports from around the world play. The quarantine didn't help, and soon the virus reached the source of the infected language, England. In the post-credits scene, Sydney and Grant survive the virus and continue speaking English, perfecting their system of verbal role-playing games. An unusual plot indeed. The viewer doesn't see the classic horror elements of societal collapse, chaos in the streets, or flesh-eating, but you can hear it since most of the film takes place in one room, with events unfolding over the radio. And strangely enough, that makes it all the more terrifying.